I will now introduce the last speaker for today. This is James Kugler. Thank you. So, James Kugler, another outstanding speaker, again from Merck. James serves as Chief Digital Officer of Merck Darmstadt, Germany, and CEO of EMD Digital, which is a subsidiary of Merck. At the age of 26, James led what would become a transformational process for Sigma-Aldrich, culminating in the creation of the largest e-commerce platform in the life science industry, generating more than $1 billion in annual revenue and serving as a catalyst for the acquisition of Sigma-Aldrich by Merck in 2015 for $17 billion. The question that keeps him up at night is how to help scientists make science faster. So James, it is a pleasure to have you here with us today. And we understand you are in a different time zone, so we greatly appreciate your commitment. And now we are going to listen to you. You have a very attractive talk. So Pragmatically, Radical Digitalization. So let's find out what it is all about.
Excellent. I appreciate it. And it's good to see everyone here. I will say if I was told that there is a very strict timekeeping today. So the sun will rise in, I believe, 30 minutes here in Boston. And so I think, unfortunately, you'll just miss that portion of it, but hopefully we can get some energy going into it. So it's a pleasure to be here. Again, my name is James Kugler. I'll go kind of rapid fire because I thought it would be fun to keep things nice and fast around this thing out. I'm super excited about the progress that's been made on the data science side at Merck over the last couple of years. The fact that an event like this is taking place is really extraordinary. And the minds in Darmstadt and beyond is really an incredible group of people. So I thought it'd be good maybe for those that I don't know and haven't talked to before, I'll give a quick introduction to myself. So I'm in Boston right now. I lived in Germany for the last couple of years, but I grew up in Cape Cod. So I grew up in this town, Brewster. It was settled in 1656. I was one of the maybe handful of people that lived there year round. Brewster was kind of interesting because it had its economy was essentially focused on salt for a while. So you had Cape Cod Bay where the tide would go out for about 2 miles, and then you'd have the salt water resting on boards and it would dry, and then you'd have salt, right? So I basically started in this land of salt. And I went and wanted to be kind of a musician, right? And then accidentally kind of got into science in high school. And my junior year of high school, started doing some bioinformatics work at Harvard Med School. My last year of high school, went to MIT and started doing computational biophysics research. Then went to WashU in St. Louis, where I studied biomedical engineering, and in parallel was working as a research fellow in genetics at Harvard Med with George Church. And I think we built like the fastest, cheapest genome sequencing machine in the world for all of something like 3 months until someone made one way faster and way cheaper than us. And I was really excited and intent on becoming an academic and going and doing an MD PhD program. And then the president and vice president of Sigma kind of tricked me into joining Sigma-Aldrich instead. And so somehow I wound up sort of full circle at a place that was very good at packaging sodium chloride into much smaller quantities at much higher purity levels. And at Sigma, I started on the corporate strategy and planning side. We were starting digital transformation at that point in time, very similar to what we've been doing over the last few years at Merck. And it was focused on e-commerce, so looking at the web. And so we had a redesign of sigmaaldrich.com that was very successful. We increased, I think, sales on it by about $100 million in the first year. But it was all about just focusing on how are people doing what they're doing. So we had customer insight teams and ethnographic research teams that were just focused on observing scientists in labs and seeing what they do there. And I think we spent about a year on just eye tracking studies for product detail pages. So in case you're curious as to why a cast number is in the specific location that it is on the Sigma website, I can tell you there was an unusual amount of thought that went into that. From e-commerce, though, I went and led a project around global new product development introduction. So reducing the time it takes to get new products on the shelf from about 9 months to 1 month. Ran our biology business for a bit, and then went back to the e-commerce side, where we, as mentioned, grew the site to just over $1 billion in annual revenue. So essentially, I went full circle twice here. I went from the salt to salt. I went from the website to the website again. And I want to talk a little bit about that first before we get into the Merck piece, because Sigma Aldrich was really an extraordinary, it is still an extraordinary e-commerce site. But if you think about it, it's basically like Amazon for science. And if you think of, you know, scientists as kind of chefs, and you have a recipe for this thing that you want to create, and you have your method and materials for your experiment, we wanted to see basically how do we hack the process of just making that experimental process a little bit faster. And this was really where we started building up our hardcore data science capabilities. And part of the reason we were able to do that was because we had a really interesting kind of dynamic on the site that was different than large e-commerce sites. We could spend a lot more money on compute. So we had an extraordinary infrastructure, all the data was available to us. We could start building algorithms without concerns for the amount of compute that it was taking. So on any given page load, you were having about 150 different algorithms. But our whole goal was, could we take all of this behavior, match it to the materials and methods, and start seeing, could you predict almost what are the experiments that are being done and what experiments going to be done next? Because we have hundreds of thousands of products on the site. And you can imagine at each point here, like it takes time, right? To get the materials, to find the materials that you need to receive them. But it's also a lot of material to keep on hand, to keep an inventory. And depending on where you are in the world, that amount of time it can take to get to you can shift. So we spent a lot of time just seeing how do we make it a little bit faster, whether it's you have an experiment and you're trying to figure out what are the materials you need to run it, down to I know the material I need, how long is it going to take to get to me? Those were the problems we were really obsessing over. And these would present themselves most obviously in something like the product recommendations, where, as I mentioned, we had about 150 machine learning algorithms going on in the background with a set of selection criteria and algorithms on top to decide which one was right for the right person at that point in time. And so this is one of the earliest iterations of it. But the data science portion and the algorithmic work went way beyond that, right? So obviously we have this core product recommendation piece, but we also started looking at what does it mean to really operate at scale, whether it's how do you add millions of papers to be able to have that direct linkage between a product that's referenced in a specific paper. We had this wonderful problem of one of the most common phrases in peer-reviewed literature was unless otherwise specified, all products from Sigma, which is great. But then how do you know the specific materials that are being used in any given article? Some other cool examples, though, were, how do you get images on products? And this is a critical piece for things like organic search results, the ranking that you have in this. And so to be able to generate images of hundreds of thousands of different bottles was not feasible to actually physically take them. So we had some interesting work around, could you automatically start generating some of these? So the picture on the left of the VTech bottle is an actual image of a bottle, and our sodium chloride on the right is a generated image that we were able to do that's using the same information that's being printed on the label with the same packaging material that's there. But then we could also start thinking about it in different lenses. So on the right, you could look at a simple Markov cluster of customers from about 10 years ago. And each node here was an individual customer, and the edges between them were the number of unique products that were there. And it started giving us some new insights into just what are these customer groups that we're dealing with. And when we start seeing things like on the bottom left here that seem a little off and interesting, and you dig in and you realize these are police departments buying pseudosense to help train dogs. These were the kinds of things that we were looking at. And really cool, really great way to get started. And then in 2014, it's announced that we're being bought by Merck for 17 billion. And that's when we start getting introduced to Darmstadt, which is an equally extraordinary place. And you look at this 353-year-old company now, and it's really amazing to see the breadth that's there. But imagine we're coming from Sigma and we go in, and Merck says, we want to get digital here, right? And this wasn't a term that we were actually using as much in the US at that time. Although interestingly enough, we went through this same transformational period just a few years prior when I had initially joined Sigma in 2008. So the first question we had was simply just, what is digital, right? And we decided we were going to start by defining this as digitalization is how are we reducing friction and creating value by integrating digital technologies into everyday life, right? And the way we wanted to start looking at putting this into practice was, could we have this framework for, let's start with user experience, right? What are people actually doing? And if I can make a person's life even easier with technology, that's good, right? And that creates value. And if you can extract that value, you have a business model. And that's also good because that creates sustainability and you can grow and you get this nice feedback loop just between those two. And as that grows, you generate a lot of data. And so the ability to use that data to make that person's life even easier and the business model even more lucrative, that was the framework we wanted to try to create. And the approach that we wanted to take was to start applying this to two axes of transformation. Basically looking at it from the transformational axis along the product. So this is, what you sell and how you sell it. And the process side, which is how you do what you do, right? And if you think of incremental changes on both of those axes, you have the bottom left, which is digitalize the core. So these are things like fixing the basics, making sure that everyone can get online and they have the equipment and the tools that they need to do what they need to do. As you start going out to the right and you get more radical on the product side, you get smart products and channels. So this is looking at the product portfolio that we have. What is complementary to that? Can we start making some connected devices like syringes that we can connect and see adherence of patients, or channels like the e-commerce channel and other areas that we can be applying this. We went from digitalize the core then and up in terms of process, more radical on the process side, we have smart processes. And this at its core is data science, right? And then if you're radical across both sides, we're looking at disruptive ecosystems. And specifically, I think of those in terms of what are the multi-sided platform opportunities that exist in the spaces that you're operating in. For today, though, I want to focus on data, right? Because this is AISTAR, this is Data Science Conference here. And I have to say, we came into Merck, we're so excited. We were so excited to start tackling some of the other problems across the other businesses, especially when you're on the Sigma Aldrich side of it, which is now part of life science, where you're servicing so many of these areas because you're just enabling scientists at the core. And we have firewalls between all of our different businesses. So we start building out the data science team and we start trying to find different problems that we can work on in different places. And we quickly realized that the state of data was less than optimal, right? We were fairly spoiled. I think we complained the most that we had, two different ERP systems and we had a very clean, easy lookup table between the two systems, but it was still slightly frustrating. And so we were really working on getting that consolidated into one. But we had real-time information. We had it all in memory in SAP HANA. We had this great compute infrastructure around it. And the humbleness came because we took one of our best data scientists, we sent her to China to work on a fertility problem. And basically what was happening was, as the one-child policy was changed, we were struggling to keep up with demand of our fertility products. About 50% of the fertility products are being shipped by air. And basically we send this data scientist over, super brilliant, and she spends 3 months trying to find any data and just get access to any data that's there. And essentially she comes back 3 months later and says, we were able to pull together 18 data points, monthly sales of the fertility franchise as a whole at a country level. And we took a step back and we said, okay, we need to really start getting down to the basics of this, right? So we wanted to pull it back and say, what does it take for us to create value from data? So creating value from data is going to require 4 things. One, we have data. In ours, we absolutely did. We had 353 years of data. 2, the data has to be structured and usable. This is not a sexy part of the process, right? But unless you can access it, unless it's usable, there's not a lot else that you can do. And you wind up spending a lot of time working on that. Once it is structured and usable, though, you can apply basic to advanced analytics to start generating insights. And then the 4th thing is you can act on those insights. There's a tremendous amount of focus on step number 3 here. And I realize it's definitely the sexiest part of the problem. But the reality is the hardest part of it is number 2, right? Because when you look, especially at large enterprises, and it's not just, Merck, it's every company, you wind up with ERP landscapes and data landscapes that look like this. This is an insurance company and how they do calculations on insurance premiums. And you just look at the number of systems that you're trying to gather information from and create transformations for kind of ad hoc. And so this led us to start working with Palantir about 5 years ago or so. And there's a lot that's written about Palantir. 99% of it, I would say, is deeply inaccurate. because at the core, what they do is very unsexy, right? They basically make data pipelining and contextualizing information a first-class usability problem, right? There's no kind of magic algorithm piece that's there. There's no like weird, creepy kind of data oversight or overlord that's looking into these pieces. They provide tools for people who have data to be able to access them better and integrate them better. And you can basically take a landscape that looks like this and pull it into a pipeline, an ontology, and a lineage that looks like this. And so we had a big push, just how do we structure this information? How do we make it usable? Because once we can do that, you can start doing some really interesting things. This is something that's still ongoing. This is a constant process of trying to figure out how do we get in, how do we scale these pieces out so that we can do a lot of cool things. And in the process of this, we've managed to create a lot of cool things across all of the businesses. Michelangelo focused, on the the healthcare side of this, but we have 3 amazing businesses. So you can think of how we were leveraging data to drive value. Obviously, on the recommendation side, we look at things like research trend detection and what's happening in the state of science, to bioprocess optimization, which is the bulk of what Michelangelo looks at. Digital pathology, how can we use image recognition to assist in that process, even into internal things, like how are we connecting our internal expertise, over to impurity detection across some of the processes that you have, and simulations to be able to assist in bringing things like new packaging materials to market. But there's so much more, and there's so much more because there's just so many areas that we look into. And I find that really fascinating, because if you think of the industrial scale of a company like Merck, and especially a lot of the European companies, the large industrial European companies, I think there's opportunities that aren't fully realized yet. And I mentioned these, the kind of different pathing that you take to be able to get to different areas of transformation. And this disruptive ecosystem one is one that we really spend a lot of time thinking about. And I think a lot of it is a mindset shift in terms of people are typically on the defensive in terms of like, how is Amazon going to somehow knock me out or take over my business or take over the area of business that I'm in? When the reality is, if you can start leveraging that industrial scale you have to flip it over and start thinking of how you can disrupt these disruptive players that are there, things become interesting. I've given talks in the past on Walmart in terms of how Walmart has stores within 5 miles of 95% of the US population. And if you can flip these into warehouses, suddenly you've last mile delivery that's much closer than any Amazon warehouse is. And the capital cost to be able to build those things up is really tremendous. So when we're looking at things at Merck and we're deriving transformation across these different quadrants, the thing we look for is, where is this convergence then that we start seeing these unique opportunities where, given the scale that we have, given the customer access that we have, and the regulatory knowledge that we have, what can we do to enable science at a larger level beyond the bottle? And I mentioned, the fertility example in healthcare in China earlier. There were also examples that we failed really terribly at, right, on the data science side. And those have been, I think, typically our best learnings. One of those was in the R&D side of healthcare. We got really interested in patient stratification. So how can we figure out why certain patients are responding to certain treatments and others aren't? And we thought this was like the perfect, machine learning AI problem, that we could take a lot of the expertise that we had in that space and start applying it here, only to realize that we had this incredible depth of information on any given patient that was a part of these trials. But the number of patients was so limited. You're looking at 8 to 12 to 16, people in these trials. And you think of the sheer volume of data that you would need to actually run a statistically significant analysis across this, or have enough to be able to apply any of the techniques that we have today. And you start realizing that the foundational problem is that there simply is not enough data. And part of that is a number of reasons. One, there's no institution in the world that has enough deep, rich data to be able to actually have a corpus of information that's significant enough to do these analyses. And so then you think this is kind of existential, right? This is a big problem. Everyone should totally love this and want to get on board and create consortia and bring all the data together. But to bring all the data together, you need to agree on how you're going to bring it together. And each individual member must have their own data together in a way that they themselves can use it. And oftentimes that's not the case. And then there's no incentive to actually do so. So this led us to create Syntropy, which is our joint venture with Palantir, where we bring in Palantir's technology to be able to bring the data together in a secure way, as well as the ability to exchange and share information in a secure way. And we go to large hospitals and AMCs and cancer centers to be able to empower the scientists and researchers there to be able to do their own research faster. So bring the data together at the institution, at the lab level, so that they themselves can use it and find insights sooner, right? And then give them that ability to highly control collaboration with others at scale. And this is all building on Palantir's tech stack, adding into it this data foundation that the institution has with the ontologies, the workflows, and the decisions that flow from that. And so this has been really exciting for us because it's not just the healthcare side that becomes interesting. I mean, we look at what we're doing right now, and especially we look at the last 2 years. I mean, let's be honest, 2020 and 2021 have been very weird years, right? And it's also made it much more clear why a company like Merck exists and why it's existed for so long. We have 3 extraordinary businesses, right? On the healthcare side, and the life science side, and in the electronics side. And over the last 2 years, it's become very clear that health is a critical issue, right? People need treatments. We've had a pandemic that's required vaccines, where our life science business has been critical in the manufacture of these things. And a lot of people have been working at home. We're doing this event remotely. I'm doing this from Boston right now, right? And the criticality of chipsets and displays is becoming more and more critical. And so while I think in the past, these components may not have totally made sense, all of this totally makes sense today, right? And underpinning all of this is science and technology. That's the core piece that binds us, right? And if we think of what that means at scale, you start realizing that the things that you do from a transformational side, as long as we're focused on making science faster, we can make a huge difference, not just within Merck, but also globally at scale, particularly today. So the message I want to leave everyone with here is I am super excited about everything that we've done. When I think ahead, into what's going to happen as we come out, we have some serious things that need to be dealt with and fixed. The pandemic's not going to be over immediately, right? And this is something that will linger for a while. We need to deal with that. We have major semiconductor shortages right now globally. That's something we're going to need to deal with. And there are some foundational kind of trust aspects in society that we need to start looking into right now. But I'm super hopeful that at the end of this, science kind of becomes the hero in all of this. And anything that we can do to promote that is really extraordinary. So with that, I want to thank everyone. Total pleasure to be here. Sun is still 7 minutes away from coming up, but looking forward to doing any questions that people have.
Fantastic talk, James. I think truly inspiring. Thank you very much for this. I see a lot of questions actually coming up. So I have one question that is about the future. So looking forward 10 years, what do you think will be the biggest changes brought by digitalization technologies in your work?
So it's a really weird question, right? Because it's so different now than it was 18 months ago. I think in the first 10 months of the pandemic, we had 10 years of transformation that took place. So if you had asked me 2 years ago, the answer to that question would have been kind of where we are today. And now we're at this point. And the question is, what's going to happen next? I think the biggest unknown is, what is this change in expectation from people, right? Not just customers, but people and humans overall, because it's not just the customer expectation that's changed, it's the employee expectation that's just, and what does this mean for us? And so I think doubling down and really focusing in on what are the user experiences that are going to be relevant, just tomorrow even, right? Let alone 10 years from now. When I look 10 years from now, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole of kind of political pieces, but when I look 10 years from now, I think the biggest things that I'm hoping we start addressing is what happens when you have platforms at scale that are being hyper optimized by algorithms, and specifically affinity matching algorithms, right? I mean, when you create a recommendation for anything, right, whether it's like the Sigma Aldrich site, the recommendation set, or a Facebook newsfeed, or a Google newsfeed, right? You're making a probability between 0 and 1. 0% likelihood someone's going to click on it, and 100% likelihood someone's going to click on it. Zeros are good, right? You know not to show that content. Ones are good because you know to show that content. And everything in between gets really iffy. And those 0.5s are kind of the worst, right? And unfortunately, those 0.5s, I think, are the ones that make us foundationally human, right? And that's where interesting things happen. That's where you have ambiguity. That's where the human mind becomes the most critical. And we're somehow removing this overall. And I think the model that we have of data ownership in exchange for service that's then being hyper optimized by affinity matching is creating a really dangerous system for society as a whole. And that genuinely concerns me. So I think we're 10 years away from having legislators that understand how the math works, despite the irony of the math being about 50 years old, right? But I am very hopeful that we start tackling those problems. One of the things that we spend a lot of time on, I saw John Eno on the chat here, is the digital ethics side of things. I mean, we have a 353-year-old family-owned company with personally liable board members and a personally liable family. So before we moved into any digital businesses, it was totally critical for us to get the ethical side of this right. And so we borrowed a lot of the principles that we have on the bioethics advisory panel that we use for evaluating things like CRISPR and gene editing, and how we're going to approach them from a business standpoint, and applied them to the digital businesses that we're doing. And one strong position that we took was we're not going to own data, right? So on Syntropy, where we're looking at health data, we don't want to own health data on patients. And it's kind of bizarre to me, and I think it's foundationally just wrong that there's the pervasive tech model of just becoming a data vacuum and giving a service away for free in exchange for data ownership being applied to patient data, right?
Yeah.
You're giving an electronic health record away for free to a clinic in exchange for all of like commercial ownership of all of that patient's data. That should concern you, right? Because this isn't like your click behavior on the ads on Facebook. So
I actually fully agree, and I can relate to a lot of the points you raised, you mentioned in your answer. I actually have a question about Syntropy. So you are discussing this joint venture with Palantir again now, and I was actually wondering, in order to preserve the privacy aspect of data from the patients, are you actually thinking of leveraging machine learning in situ, or actually have a distributed architecture? Because of course, you know, it is like with Facebook and Apple, we've seen a lot of a paradigm shift towards a federated learning, so that you can fine-tune the algorithms in situ. So every single user can have his own fine-tuned recommendations in a way. So is this something you are also looking into at Syntropy, or you are using a different approach?
It's a different approach. The approach is really, we're just trying to enable, right? If you think of like what we do on the life science side, for example, and actually the history of Merck, even back to the very beginning, which was Merck was the first company to take a substance that was necessary for the mixing of pharmaceuticals in the apothecaries, right? And say that this thing is this thing, and it's this quality, right? It's an enablement mechanism for these other things to occur. And so on the Syntropy side, what we provide is the mechanism for the institutions to bring their own data together in this hyper secure way, but it's traceable directly to source, and it's secured from source, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if they have a change in informed consent, it's going to cascade through the environment. We're not trying to do any analyses on top of that. We create the ability for the institutions to create the analyses, but we're really careful about what it is that we're trying to do. We're not trying to do more than enable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And deal with the regulatory aspects of how do you just create that foundational enablement. It's an interesting nuance, and it's a really complicated nuance, but it's very confusing because you know, whenever we talk to especially consultants about it, they tell us this is completely insane because there's, you know, why aren't we trying to own all of the data inside of it? And that's the pervasive model. And it's just it's a very bizarre thing. So we're playing a long game on this to focus on doing the right thing.
I fully understand that. And did you find difficulties in deploying actually this in the US compared to Europe, because of the different privacy concerns and rules and regulations that are in place in the two places?
So we are more focused in the US right now, though we are starting to look at Europe as well. I would say we're focused in the US right now in part because of the massive large institutions that are having difficulty in pulling this information together. They're not dealing with, you know, federal health systems that already have data together. It's kind of interesting because we don't really have privacy issues in this, because we're not trying to do anything that's violating any privacy issues. We're basically saying we want to tackle these problems with you head on and keep this data as secure as humanly possible, abiding by every policy condition that's there. So it's, I would say most of what we do is very unsexy. It's just, how do we go in and help them pipeline this information and manage the governance on top of it to ensure that it's abiding by all of these conditions and auditable after the fact. And so what we tend to find is we have more resonance with more privacy-minded folks who peek behind the curtain and see what's actually there.
I see. Well, there was a great explanation, a great talk. I think we should do a virtual round of applause to all the speakers we have had in round. Well, we can actually react on WebEx. So still virtual, but still. So thank you very much, James. Thank you very much, Michelangelo. Thank you very much, all the speakers that we have had during today's track 2 areas of application. We are now joining track 1, where we will do some concluding remarks. So thank you very much, and see you in track 1 soon.